Racist! Fascist! Greetings and welcome to my Jolly Scholar discussion series number 5. It's kind of about Pete Seeger, but I really prefer the title Music and Spirit versus Music and Ideology. So, why this video? Like I said, I'm not really making this video to vilify Pete Seeger. It's about Pete Seeger and it's not. It really is about music and spirit versus music and ideology, and how that dichotomy played out through Pete Seeger and the movement he was part of. Secondly, I want to draw attention to how the movement that Pete Seeger was a part of is still playing a virulent role in our society today. Different faces and entities, but the same playbook. There's not enough space or really an interest on my part for a biography of Pete Seeger. If you're intrigued by what I cover in this discussion, there are a number of biographies, websites, and videos on YouTube that you can research. I've created a playlist on my YouTube channel that you can explore, and all the videos I refer to in this discussion are listed there, and you'll see the pop-up. So, following a brief interview of Seeger's background, I'm going to cover several specific events, all readily available to the public, to demonstrate just how relevant Seeger and his role in popular culture and his role in the civil rights movement is to our political landscape today. So, let's get on with it. Pete Seeger, he came from a well-known academic family, all Ivy League and all communists. This isn't my opinion. It's always been their own stated identity. So, about the family. I'm just taking this from random articles, Wikipedia, but again, it's stuff that's very well known already. So Seeger was born on May 3rd, 1919, at a French hospital in Midtown Manhattan. His family, which Seeger called enormously Christian in the Puritan Calvinist New England tradition. So they went back for 200 years and blah, 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 go into their whole background. But Seeger's father is Harvard-trained composer and musicologist, Charles Louis Seeger, Jr. He was born in Mexico City, Mexico, to American parents. Charles established the first musicology curriculum in the U.S. at the University of California, Berkeley. And keep that in mind because that will be important throughout. In 1913, he helped found the American Musicology Society and was a key founder of the academic discipline of ethnomusicology. And that's what my PhD is in. Pete's mother, Constance de Claver Seeger, née Edson, raised in Tunisia and trained at the Paris Conservatoire of Music, was a concert violinist and later a teacher at Juilliard School. Now, for those of you who know about the Paris Conservatory and Juilliard, this is pretty, pedigreed? I don't know. So in 1912, his father, Charles Seeger, was hired to establish the music department at the University of California, Berkeley, but was forced to resign in 1918 because of his outspoken pacifism during World War I. Now, I want to emphasize how the word pacifism is used very selectively when they talk about, especially socialists, and we'll get to that. Right? It's not necessarily that they were pacifists. It depended on who we were fighting that they would become pacifists. Pete Seeger attended Harvard, and then he dropped out. He says to be a folk singer, and to give him credit, he was. But any brief overview of his career makes it abundantly clear that that was not really his main objective. He dropped out to be an activist, and what I'm calling masquerading as a folk singer. So I want to draw attention to the kind of folk music that we're sort of looking at before we get to Seeger, and it affected Seeger a lot. And that was the Carl Sandburg American Song Bag. Now, Carl Sandburg was a very famous poet, but he also collected American, what we would call folk songs. These songs were very deeply human, and what I call deep humanism, what I would also call a real folk. Sailing shanties, railroad songs, cowboy songs, gallows songs, outlaw, drinking songs, criminal songs, love ballads, universal life and death themes. I want to emphasize real people, real occupations, and classes. And I'm going to contrast that with where I'm going to be going. So, by the way, many biblical references. And very few, if any, political jingles. Anti-war, yes, but without the political slant. We're talking about universal anti-war. or commentary on the futility of war or what war brings. And this is a long tradition everywhere. And this, I'll give you an example of a song that I liked a lot. Verily the trees grow and very they grow high. She says, I'm twice 12 and he's born 14. And the refrain goes, he's young, but he's daily growing. And as it goes on through one verse after another, it turns out the young boy, he's young. Her father married her to him because he comes from a good family. And he was also of the aristocratic class. And so he goes to war early. He fathers a son, goes to war and dies. And, I think by the time he's 22, he's already passed away and he's left a widow and a son. So in that sense, when I'm talking about anti-war, in a much more universal sense, not anti this specific war because you have a political agenda about it. So there was also the father and son ethnomusicologists, John and Alan Lomax. John Lomax particularly loved cowboy songs, but he collected a huge number of all different kinds of folk songs, from gospel to prison songs, railroad, drinking songs, you name it. He was very prolific. The father and son team also worked with a black singer named Leadbelly. It was really Ledbetter, but he was called Leadbelly. The relationship with the father soured over finances and copyrights and image management. And this would be kind of important, right? The father wanted to pose him in prison overalls all the time and sensationalize the fact that he was in prison for murder. The songs collected by people like Sandberg and the Lomaxes were truly folk songs. They were songs and ballads of people from all walks of life, and they were all about people and life experiences. There was, of course, the occasional songs with current political content, but that was very rare, and it wasn't a large number or a significant category. The collections were what I'd call humanist repertoire, about people and their lives, legends, fictional characters, real characters, all the range of human experiences. So one of the points that I'm really going to drive with this discussion is humanism versus political ideology. And you can also say music and spirit versus music and ideology. So I'm talking about real culture, real folk, with a real past, a real present, and a real culture, versus the social construction of identity. Keep that in mind. In the more extreme theoretical models we get out of the universities, we get this social construction of reality. And this is really where the so-called intellectuals are truly hallucinating. But I digress. So let's look briefly at a case in point. The Folkways record label. Folkways Records and Service Company was founded by Moses Ash and Marion Distler in 1948, New York City. And so you can look this up and learn more about it if you like. But basically, the idea was to collect folk music from all around the world, and they did a great job of it. Now, the Smithsonian Institute bought Folkways record, and that was in 1986. So there's a Folkways festival that's held every year on the Mall, right here in D.C. When I started going to that and looking at the Folkways records there at the Smithsonian, there's a huge emphasis on folk music as political music, because Moses Ash promoted Pete Seeger a lot, recorded him and Woody Guthrie, two people obviously we're going to get to. The point is that now you go to the website and there's a huge collection of music from all over the world, and some of it's quite good. But when you look at this folk music, you'll notice the appearance of religion, culture, the spiritual is everywhere. You can't get around it. But I have to emphasize that when I first started going to the Smithsonian and going to these festivals, when you looked at the website, most of at least when they did the handout to promote the Folkways, it was all political, and all political left. I know there was one album with Che Guevara's picture right on the front, that very famous, iconic Che Guevara, but I can't even find it this last time I went. It doesn't mean it's not there. So it's much more expansive and indicative of really what Moses Ash was doing. But for some reason, there was this huge emphasis on the political, and you'll see how that's important. So let's take a look at, for instance, when Folkways was not operating as what I'm calling a jingle jukebox for the left, they did a lot of good work. And when they did, you get this. Let's take the case of bluegrass. Bluegrass music came out of the rural South after World War II, but its roots date back to the 1930s. The genre was named after Bill Monroe's band, the Bluegrass Boys, who began performing in the 1940s. Now, I just have to tell you, the roots of that music, it goes back to Ireland and Scotland and England. Bluegrass songs were about issues important to everyday people. Religion was a prominent subject, and gospel music figured heavily in the development of the bluegrass sound. Secular songs tended to focus on love, home, and family, sometimes exploring the darker sides of these issues. You notice, they don't even mention politics. Again, keep that in mind as I'm moving along. So Folkway Records was a key step in the academic construction of a tradition that Seeger and others would then promote as a folk song revival. Not just as an American folk tradition, but with a global scope as well. And we'll see this emerge because it's going to tie into the, believe it or not, the labor movement. Notice the term revival itself. Those of you familiar with the American Christian Protestant revivalism know that the term is closely aligned with what a lot of scholars have called the series of great awakenings that have punctuated actually the history of our nation since colonial days. These important cultural movements consisted of what sometimes were called camp meetings and other venues away from the social order, another analog of that into the forest theme coined by Nietzsche that I use a lot, where a community looks for deeper levels of experience and meaning away from day-to-day life. It's very American, but it's also very human, and it forms a very strong current in all of European cultural traditions, at least as far back as the classical Dionysian cult, the processions that so impressed Nietzsche. Again, a community of people temporarily leave the social order to go into the forest, the desert, wherever, in pursuit of a deeper level of experience. So keep in mind the Great Awakenings. There was one in the colonial era, and many people actually suggest that this was the pivotal kind of cultural upheaval or impetus that led to the revolution. I'll just briefly give you an example of what I mean. By branching off into their own denominations, right? There's a Church of England. By going into the forest, having these revivals where they thought they would have their own personal relationship with God in their own communal ways, and these were not uniform at all. These different ideas that you could approach God as a community on your own, right? This is supposedly what the Protestants were saying to the Catholics, but by the time you get to the Anglican Church, it's just a repeat of the Catholic Church. These people were breaking away again, more like the Baptists had done before. And so when they break away and they have these revelations, they begin to think, okay, we can make our own churches here in America, our own churches, as many as we like. So what they're saying is they don't need the Church of England. Well, who's the head of the Church of England? The King of England, right? That was the whole purpose of Henry VIII's revolt. So if they don't need the Church of England, maybe they don't need the King of England either. This was pivotal in the thinking. It changed the whole cultural attitude about the relationship to England. And you'll see with these, one of the musical styles that came out of this period is called sacred harp. And the sacred harp tradition is still with us today. In fact, one of its greatest gifts to America is the song Amazing Grace, which, by the way, is about slavery. It's really about redemption, but it's about a man that was involved in the slave trade, and after an ordeal at sea, he promises God that he will get out of that ugly business, and he becomes a preacher, and he starts to preach against slavery. So that song reemerges periodically in our history. And you'll see when we get to the Newport Festival, when you get to Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, Joan Baez revitalizes that song once more. But actually it's been with us forever. In fact, the last time I looked, one of the last times I've seen Joanne Baez sing that song publicly was at Burning Man. Burning Man is very interesting too, and maybe we'll get to that and at least touch on that a little bit more. Now, these folk revival festivals, such as the Newport festivals that we'll be looking at shortly, were something of a commercial, cultural, activist performance events that function as performance and community counterpart to what we find in the early Folkways label collections. Right? Now they have these collections of politically inclined protest songs, and then we have actual events to promote these protest songs and these political songs. Again, we're still calling them folk songs, and that's part of my whole thesis here. I'll be asking, well, what folk were they referring to? So as to be distinguished from other folk music venues, Folkways Records and the Newport Folk Festivals were highly selective towards leftist political activism. In this context, there was to be no inclusion of Christian spirituality whatsoever, or as little as possible, even though Christian spirituality was at the core of the actual American revival movements, what I'm not calling, the academics have called the Great Awakenings, that have played such an important role in our history. Right? This was never alluded to. In fact, in Folkways record, I think on the site now they do have some Sacred Heart. But this is so downplayed. I mean, Seeger never even mentions it. The point I'm making is that there are no non-religious folk people anywhere on planet Earth. None. They don't exist. So how did these folk festivals manage to avoid this fact? How did the Newport Folk Festivals and the so-called folk music revival movement avoid the simple fact that there's no folk without religion, and the religion of this country, especially at that time, well, still is today, is overwhelmingly Christian? So how did they avoid that? Well, very carefully. That's how. Very selectively. And this will play out. You'll see what I mean. It's very deliberate. So, Seeger was a dedicated union organizer. Pete Seeger was a dedicated union organizer. That's what he went out doing with his music. He used his interest in music to contribute to those efforts by creating a musical idiom, political jingles, really, that served a number of uses. And here's how they worked. The union organizers, Pete Seeger and others, would invite people to the union recruitment meetings and sing and teach these jingles to the recruits. It made the meetings more interesting, and the words of the songs presented the political messages and the emotional sentiments that the union organizers wanted to spread and instill. The union members would then sing these jingles at the picket lines, and this gave it an extra kind of power. The songs themselves would be imbued with much more power when they're actually sung at picket lines. And sometimes these picket lines could get violent. So furthermore, the union members could sing these songs around their friends and family when they went home and help spread the word that way too. So this was a very powerful step towards the advancement of early cultural Marxism here in America. And this was precipitated by the arrival of the Frankfurt School just prior to World War II, the think tank that created cultural Marxism. And where did the refugee Frankfurt School members ensconce themselves? First at Berkeley on the West Coast, and then at Columbia University on the East Coast. So let's look at real manifestations of this social political strategy. The Almanac Singers were an American New York City-based folk music group. Right there, doesn't that sound odd? American New York City-based folk music group. Active between 1940 and 1943. Founded by Millard Lampell, Lee Hayes will be very important, Pete Seeger, and Woody Guthrie, which is what we will really be focusing on. The group specialized in what they call topical songs, mostly songs advocating an anti-war, anti-racism, and pro-union philosophy. They were part of the Popular Front, an alliance of liberals and leftists, including the Communist Party of the USA, whose slogan under their leader, Earl Browder, was, now I want this to sink in because this will become very important too, Communism is the 20th century Americanism. Right? This was the slogan of the Communist Party USA. Pete Seeger was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. I'm not faulting him for that. It's central to the discussion, but that's not the problem, the fact that he was a communist. Oops. So just to summarize again, the Communist Party USA, led by a fellow named Earl Browder, had as its basic slogan, communism is the 20th century Americanism. So this is a period in which socialism had divided into very distinct and very mutually belligerent strains. Communist socialism and national or fascist socialism. I discussed the differences in my discussion number 1, the true political spectrum. I presented it in my Goodbye to Facebook video. In that context, any notion of communism being the Americanism of the 20th century is not only an oxymoron, it's also intentionally very misleading. Communist socialism is always global. All national identities are to be deconstructed as forms of false consciousness. This, of course, is the opposite of the National Socialists, who would build their socialism around a nation state or an ethnicity, or both. So keep in mind that although the Almanac Singers presented themselves as American folk singers, their aspirations and political networks were definitely global. So again, what folk were they representing? Furthermore, the division between communist socialism and a national socialism had a lot to do with when the folk singers decided to be pacifists or not. This is what I was alluding to earlier. If it looked like the U.S. might be going to war against or siding against a communist nation like Russia, then they were pacifists. But if they were going to war against fascism or National Socialism, then they willingly supported the effort and sometimes even volunteered. Well, not Seeger or Guthrie. But more on that later. The CIO was dominated by new unions in the metalworking industries, the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, the United Electrical Workers. And industrial unionism was not simply a kind of unionism, but a kind of social reconstruction. Now listen to that again. Industrial unionism was not simply a kind of unionism, but a kind of social reconstruction. It is in this context of the social movement that the story of the Almanac Singers, which formed in 1941, ought to be seen. So do you see what they're saying here? The purpose of the Almanac Singers, was to help reconstruct society. Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century. And again, it's misleading because they knew perfectly well. The Almanac Singers were not National Socialists. They were definitely global communists. So the idea of the Americanism as America as something to celebrate and further is absolutely not what they wanted to do. So right in there, you're starting to see something that looks extremely, anywhere between wherever you want to put it, treacherous, hypocritical, maybe naive on the part of the followers, but certainly not on the part of the leaders. So they're presenting themselves as quintessential Americanism, folk music of America. But as we're going to see, this folk music didn't have any folk. And this America was something they were actually trying to reconstruct. Now, the CIO supported Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal coalition, and it was open to African Americans. Both the CIO and its rival, the AFL, American Federation of Labor, grew rapidly during the Great Depression. The rivalry for dominance was bitter and sometimes violent. The Congress for Industrial Organization was founded on November 9th, 1935, by international unions belonging to the American Federation of Labor. Now, put this into context. International unions. So we have American companies but they're linking up with international unions. Again, this is global Marxism, global socialism. Okay. So notice some little thoughts I'm going to put together for you. Okay, we have international, and we have this world music. We have music for labor unions. And in the case of Seeger, definitely internationally linked labor unions. Seeger was a definite communist, not a national socialist. Again, that's where the oxymoron, that's where the irony here, right? He's, I want to say pretending, maybe that's a little bit, but yes, he's pretending that this is American, when as a global communist, he can't really be sincere about that. He can't be. So communism is 20th century Americanism. That's a very insincere statement. Look at the song, If I Had a Hammer. Probably familiar with it, right? So the first line is, if I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, blah, blah, blah. Then the next one is, if I had a bell. Well, you ask me, where'd the bell come from? I mean, the hammer we know, right? It's the hammer and sickle of the Communist Party. But where's the bell come from? Well, think about it. It's the Liberty Bell. That's the American part. See, they're wedding the two together. The communist hammer and the American Liberty Bell. But again, use your common sense. How does that work? Americanism is not compatible with communism. The utter foundations of the nation and what the earlier forefathers and the American people, what they aspired to, was so far from communism, there's no connection there. In fact, they're mutually antagonistic. Unless you intend to radically transform America or reconstruct it. Now, where have we heard that before? So at that time, Russia was the key player in the spread of global communism with the United States and globally. Within the United States and globally. Russia and the unions. And we're going to see that that is clearly the case. But as we know today, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, almost all the unions in the U.S. had already become non-communist. The unions had rejected communism for a lot of reasons. And in the years leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union, the unions and the working class had also already been sold out. This is as China was stepping up as the new global communist driver. Now keep that in mind. However, China was not responsible for that. Well, yes, they were, but the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that the communists were thrown out of the unions is the key concept for you to keep in mind. And you'll see how this becomes very important over the last 5 or 6 years, right? But hold those thoughts. We'll be getting to them. So now let's look at an article on the Almanac Singers, and it concerns an album they did called The Songs of John Doe. This is in the Atlantic Monthly. And it's entitled The Poison in Our System. The writer pronounced Songs for John Doe, quote, strictly subversive and illegal, unquote. Whether communist or Nazi financed. Remember I was talking about earlier when those two large unions were going at each other's throats. They're actually conglomerations of unions. It might have been exactly for they're alluding right here. Some were going communist, which is global international, and some might have been going more national. As a matter for the Attorney General, observing further, that mere legal suppression would not be sufficient to counteract this type of populist poison. The poison being folk music and the ease with which it could be spread. You're seeing a lot of echoes, right? I mean, there's a whole tapestry unfolding here. So that generation knew that communism and National Socialism were two sides of the same coin. So in other words, this critique of the Songs of John Doe being sung by the Almanac Brothers was suggesting that it didn't matter to him whether or not it was communist or fascist, National Socialist. That both needed to be suppressed. Not something I would go along with, but as far as, suppressing it, but this person was pretty damn determined. That generation knew that communism and National Socialism were two sides of the same coin. Both the fascists and the anti-fascists disrupted each other's meetings and demonstrations, and both attacked the other in the streets or wherever. Sound familiar? Except that today's so-called Antifa or anti-fascists are using fascist tactics against a party that has nothing to do with socialism one way or the other. I know they'll scream that everybody who's not a progressive liberal, Republicans or whoever, are fascists. I try to make this very clear in discussion number one, the political spectrum. If you're a libertarian, constitutional Republican, you can't be a fascist. You understand? Fascism is a form of socialism. You have communist socialism and you have National Socialism or fascism. Those two are at each other's throats, but don't confuse either one of them with what the American Constitution, with the Democratic Republic. We don't really have anything to do with either one, which is why my father's generation fought both of them, right? We fought the Nazis. We held off the Soviet Union in a Cold War, and we fought the communists directly, first in Korea and then in Vietnam. For better or worse, okay? So in 1940, Lee Hayes, and he was one of the founders with both the Almanac Brothers and the Weavers, along with Pete Seeger, they co-founded the Almanac Brothers, which promoted peace and isolationism during World War II, working with the American Peace Mobilization. It featured many songs opposing entry of the U.S. into the war. In June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the APM changed its name to the American People's Mobilization and altered its focus to supporting U.S. entry into the war. The Almanac supported the change and produced many pro-war songs, urging the U.S. to fight on the side of the Allies. The Almanac Singers disbanded after the U.S. entered the war. You see what I was saying? In other words, when it looked like we were focusing, or America was focusing its attention against the anti-communism of the Russians, then the Almanac Singers didn't want anything to do with that, and then they would call themselves a peace movement and an isolation movement. However, as soon as it looked like, we're going to go the war against the Nazis, and the Nazis had invaded Russia, then they were all for it. You see what I mean? It's a very selective pacifism. So the peace movement was only for peace if America was contemplating entering into a war against a communist socialist country, but not at all if the war was against their rivals, a national socialist country. But eventually the songs written by the Almanac Singers got better and better, and the performers themselves got better and better, to the point that the musicians began to realize they could enter the mainstream commercial market and maybe have an even greater effect. And I'll keep that in mind, into the commercial market, because this will be important. So now let's look at the Weavers. The Weavers were formed in November 1948 by Ronnie Gilbert, Lee Hayes, Fred Hellerman, and Pete Seeger. Woody Guthrie is not with the Weavers. At the Hellerman suggestion, the group took its name from a play by Gerhard Hauptmann, Die Weber, The Weavers, 1892, a powerful work depicting the uprising of the Silesian Weavers in 1844, which contains the lines, "I'll stand it no more, come what may." Sounds kind of noble. I like it. Now, in one of the historical videos on the list, you'll hear this comment about dressing down. And I'm talking about the Weavers. It's a kind of a documentary on the Weavers. So what they're saying is that the Weavers wanted to present themselves, regular folk people. They're from New York, okay. From Ivy League, Harvard, Berkeley. Okay. So they wanted to dress down and look like regular people, folk people, singing their folk music. Again, the whole concept is totally phony, because all you have to do is Google the Weavers, and 9 out of 10 times they're dressed in coat and ties. The video documentary itself was a piece of propaganda. It was kind of like trying to reinvent them. Recall that John Lomax was always getting Leadbelly to dress in overalls, even prison overalls, for the effect, to look more folksy. Yet again, as I said earlier, if you Google pictures of Leadbelly, he looks sharp. Start to see what I mean by this phony folk people construction? It shows up in silly details like this, dressing down and dressing up. But it gets way more sinister as we go along. So the Weavers had a lot of hits, and they made a lot of money. They were blacklisted during the McCarthy era in the 50s. And they did lose a lucrative Decca Records contract. So let's go back and focus a little bit more on Pete Seeger himself. His early activism was also spent organizing unions in the Appalachian coal mining industry. And this gave him a lot of opportunity to explore the music of that area in an effort to use the music as a tool for spreading Marxism. But after a number of union versus company setbacks, some of them bloody, Seeger and the Marxists were practically driven out of the Appalachian scene, especially as his communist activism became too well known. From then on, the term redneck became the only ethnic smear that you can still, to this day, say openly and with utter disdain in the most polite of liberal society. So where'd the term come from? Well, among the rednecks themselves, it used to mean, you're out there working in the fields and your neck got burnt, right? Because the hat went this way, but not that way. So, the union workers would wear red kerchiefs. And that would distinguish them that they were union workers versus scabs, and also, I guess, kind of like a uniform. And that's where we get the term redneck. But once Seeger and them were thrown out by those same people who were wearing the red, he got them to wear the red kerchiefs. But again, the communist unions did not do well. Unions stayed around, but the communist activists and leaders were thrown out. So from then on, Marxists, rather than extolling the Appalachians as a tough, salt-of-the-earth, working-class peoples, those same people suddenly became the subject of ugly documentaries and propaganda, denigrating them as an ignorant, inbred, backward population. Hollywood couldn't resist getting a few licks in with movies, and this is, again, decades later, but like Deliverance. Those of you who have seen Deliverance, you know what I'm talking about. You can look that movie up. Burt Reynolds, for some reason, took that role. Don't ask me why, but it's very vicious towards the Appalachian people. And what other American ethnicity could Hollywood have possibly made a movie like that and gotten away with it? So there have been a number of recent documentaries over the past decade or so revealing just how culturally rich the Appalachian people really were and still are. But too late. The damage was done and the image persists to this day. Does that sound familiar? Fast forward 2016, when the working blue-collar class of what is now the Rust Belt, once the backbone of the Democratic Party in that region, didn't support Hillary Clinton in 2016, what did they suddenly become? Right? Deplorables, racists, phobics, low information voters, holding on to their Bibles and their guns. See how that works? These Rust Belt Union members of 2016 were no longer affiliated with any form of socialism, and they had been sold out completely by the socialist leadership during the preceding decades. So let's just look at that a little bit. Remember, Obama shut down the coal mines overnight, and we'll get to what damage that did. But he told he was basically telling the workers to accept the inevitable. He closed them down overnights, and what he said to, I think it was to Trump, what are you going to do, wave a magic wand? It's a done deal, Trump. Nothing you can do now. It's gone. Blue-collar workers suddenly were on welfare in Appalachia. First time ever. Cenk Uygur of MSNBC he does a documentary down there. Well, it's not really a documentary, just as a report. And he's so into this. Look at all these white people on welfare. The biggest concentration of white people on welfare in the whole United States. Okay, he doesn't mention the fact that the reason they were on welfare was because Obama just overnight shut down the coal mines. So I was a bit suspicious about this, and I looked this up, and I found another documentary where they were, first of all, it was the first generation of the Appalachian people ever being on welfare. And they're already off of it. But the opioid crisis, okay? Look where this is going, because it does get sinister. So They're shut down overnight, and Cenk Uyghur goes in there and just gloats over it, right? All these white people on welfare, and never mentioning why. Then I see another documentary which explains the whole thing. And they're interviewing these people, and these people are saying, we had a good life. I was putting my kids in college. I own my house. This was devastating. I mean, they were just suddenly out of work. So that's where the whole Appalachian welfare scam documentary came out of, right? But that's the one that made it into mainstream news, and the one that I'm talking about, probably hardly anyone has ever seen. Now let's look at, briefly as in passing, who was targeted by the opioid crisis? Blue-collar working class. Any outcry from the Democratic Party? The universities? Not a word. It's those deplorable redneck racists. Who cares about them? They deserve it. It was Trump, the capitalist, who came to help the American working class, the now rednecks and deplorables, that the Marxists had tried to seduce back in the 40s and 50s. It's these present-day descendants of the unions that supported Trump. Do you see the irony? Seeger and company, the Marxist movement in general, unionizes people from Appalachia and into the Midwest because that's the working class, right? The unions become strong, but these people are salt of the earth folk people. They're real people. You can't just gut Christianity out of them. They weren't interested in his communism. They weren't interested in his anti-Christianity. So eventually the unions got rid of the communists, both in Appalachia and eventually in what we now call the Rust Belt. So what started to happen? The union leaders, the universities, were at this time seeing Russia as falling by the wayside and making their deals with China. And the deal was made to just sell these people out. They were increasingly less useful to the party. And in a sense, they never thought that they would stop voting Democrat anyways. But for the new reconstruction of America, based on an information, bureaucratic, and much weaker nation, they were perfectly willing to sell them out. And it's what they did. The union leaders sold the unions out completely. And they joined forces with the neocons. I mean, let's be real about that too, global capitalists. And they sold them out to China. It's unbelievable how much this sellout was. We're only now starting to realize it because it was done right under our noses. Again, capitalist neocons, globalist communists. If you looked at my first discussion, all communism manifests as fascism. All socialism manifests as fascism. It's what we're seeing emerging right now. So the union workers were completely sold out. And they didn't even know that this had been done to them. It's really Trump that pointed it out to them. And then they didn't vote for the first time for the Democratic Party in decades. And by the way, in case you haven't noticed, they're very angry. So let me say it again. The leaders of those same unions that Seeger helped establish back in the 40s and 50s, decades later collaborated with the Democratic Party and the neocons to sell the American blue collar out. Not to the Russian industry, which was collapsing, but the new rising communist powerhouse, the Chinese. This sellout began as early as the mid-1970s, but the real acceleration of the sellout started after the fall of the Soviet Union and went into overdrive under Obama. Russian communist infiltration, the primary funding source and ideological engine during Seeger's time, has now been replaced by the Chinese in our time. But it's the same playbook. Russia now has become the enemy all of a sudden because they're no longer part of the global communist movement anymore. Russia collusion hoax, Russia, instead of China. Again, however you feel about Trump, he saw this. Russia's not the enemy. The sellout went to China. The Chinese are the benefactors and beneficiaries. They're funding. They're making money and they're funding the movements here. Does this sound familiar? It's the same playbook decades later, just different faces and entities. Now I'm going to make a brief, I think it's a fascinating digression, but it's very relevant. So, this is a moment to talk briefly about what happened only back in 2015 when the now communist superpower China opened a factory here in the US. In post-industrial Ohio, get that, post-industrial Ohio? A Chinese billionaire opens a factory in an abandoned General Motors plant. I mean, right there, in an abandoned General Motors plant in post-industrial Ohio. He hires 2,000 Americans. I mean, they must have been happy. Early days of hope and optimism give way to setbacks as high-tech China clashes with working-class America. It's not really the high-tech part that was the clash. It's a documentary. It's called American Factory. It's done by Stephen Bognar and Julia Reichert. It's about a Chinese company, Fuyao's factory in Moraine City, near Dayton, that occupies Moraine Assembly, a shuttered General Motors plant. Filming was done in 2015 to 2017. Okay, here's another little kernel for you. Unions were prohibited. Why? It's a communist China has just opened a factory and unions are banned. Look, the original unions, actually one of the first unions ever was the Catholic Church. It's called the Knights of Columbus. Unions were not invented by the communists. In fact, my old high school teacher, I don't know if he was right, unions had never been a big fascination of mine, but he said one of the downfalls of Marxism was that they never predicted the union. Marx never really conceived that unions would rise up, that they would evolve. But regardless of how you feel about that, it is ironic that a communist country comes here after they've been fomenting, right? The Russian communists fomented unions in this country until, of course, the unions turned on them. But the Chinese would not want a union. So, what's the logic there? Well, think about it. If the Communist Party owns the factory, the means of production, and the party represents the people, who would the unions be representing? The party, in a sense, is the union. I mean, they're not at all. They're an administration class, but they don't position themselves that way. The Communist Party represents the people. So if you have a union, you're having a union that would be contrary or in opposition to the people? Well, you can't, right? So there's a real friction point. This was a real friction point between American workers and the Chinese management. The Chinese were very contemptuous towards what they considered to be the pampered, weak, undisciplined, and lazy American worker. I don't know, maybe that's what socialist unions do to you, I don't know. But they did try to humor the American workers with flattery and feigned concessions. Listen to this. As one Chinese manager put it, you must stroke an ass in the direction its hair grows. Well, they're good at that. That kind of underhanded. Well, that's not too underhanded. That's right in your face, right? The Australians are now having a confrontation with China. I don't know if you've been following that. And one of the remarks that I don't know if it was the ambassador or a representative of China was talking about the Australians as chewing gum stuck on the sole of their shoes. Just scrape it off. Look at Solidarity in Poland. It was a Catholic Labor Party. It was even led by priests. As you know, Pope John Paul II was a union leader in Solidarity. It was outlawed, of course, by the Communist Party and then reluctantly forced to tolerate them. That is, the government was forced, just by the sheer size of the Union and their growing power, to at least tolerate them. And it led to the downfall of Communist Poland. Unions became the enemies of Marxism. How ironic, huh? But the retaliation was incredibly vindictive, as we witnessed both in the American Appalachia and now in the Rust Belt. Very vindictive. Deplorables, hold on to your guns and to your Bibles, you low information voters, you racists, you bigots. So workers' unions in general backfired on Marxist regimes, and eventually they were not only abandoned, but the workers themselves were sold out. That's what happened here. And as I pointed out, many of these workers and their descendants in the unions form a substantial constituency of the supporters of Trump. How ironic, huh? Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. So back to Appalachia and the Midwest union organizing. All this early activist effort by Seeger and company were directed mainly to convert the working class of America to, I'm saying facetiously, Marxianity. Communism is the new Americanism, and through them, the nation as a whole would become communist. In that effort, Seeger and company, I'm using that facetiously, right? Seeger was not the only one. He was one among many. And him and Woody Guthrie are just very famous because of their music. So Seeger and company, the cultural Marxists, largely failed both in the coal mines of Appalachia and in the manufacturing belt of the Midwest. The unions eventually rejected and turned on the communists. But that failure taught Seeger and the movement in general some powerful lessons. So let's go first. After McCarthyism, they knew from then on, don't use the word communism. Just use progressive liberalism. Focus on the universities and this youth culture that was emerging in the 1960s. Which, by the way, Russian defectors have pointed out that the Russians played a heavy role pushing, the hippie movement, especially pushing it into a political direction. But I'll do another discussion on that era of the civil rights movement, and actually that it was a spiritual movement. It was one of the Great Awakenings, and that's what it's called, the Fourth Great Awakening. But that's another subject. Under progressive liberalism, Marxist fascism, and I say that very deliberately, all you have to do is look at China. It's called the People's Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, and control capitalism, control religion, and a dominant ethnicity. They may call themselves communists, they are fascists. They're a national socialist movement. At least in China they are. So under progressive liberalism, Marxist fascism has now dominated the universities. But it started out with academics like the Seeger family, and of course the arrival of the Frankfurt School in the U.S. before World War II had even broken out. But to this day, the only unions that are actively and virulently promoting cultural Marxism, it's the teachers' unions, all comprised of university graduates completely controlled by the universities as agents for cultural Marxism, as evidenced by this 1619 project, reconstructing, reimagining, radically transforming America. Right? It's back to that theme. Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century, but they miscalculated. Well, not completely. They sowed the seeds then, but it's manifesting now in the 21st century. The other point, the other lesson that Seeger and company learned was move deeply into the rising civil rights movement that was already underway due to the work of the black churches. We really must emphasize that the civil rights movement was one of the great awakenings, and it was led by Christians. It was led by the Christian churches. The Marxists moved into it after it was already underway. I'll be looking at this American Christian phenomenon more in future discussions for many reasons. But for now, it's enough to just make clear that the civil rights movement was initially a Christian movement. That is to say, a spiritual movement first, a political movement second. And it is considered by many American historians to have been a direct product of the fourth or third Great Awakening, depending how it's reckoned, just as the abolition movement was considered to have been the product of the second Great Awakening. Seeger did do some good work for the civil rights movement, and he should be commended for that. What did the black nation pay for the help they received from the Marxists? And did they even need it to start with? I'm asking the question, what did the civil rights movement lose from its alliance with cultural Marxism, as epitomized by the role that Pete Seeger played in that movement? Now, I'm certainly not claiming that Pete Seeger himself played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement, but the forces he represented certainly did. Cultural Marxists replaced a spiritual movement with a political agenda. This is going to be a theme, a recurrent theme with me. What price did the black community pay for that involvement? Okay, so now just a brief summary. After the setbacks with McCarthyism and the rejection by the workers' unions, cultural Marxism regrouped within the universities, infiltrated the youth movement through folk music revivals. And it's going to be the subject of the second half of this discussion. Continue infiltrating the civil rights movement, worked on the peace movement, which was to promote the anti-Vietnam War movement. As I said already, they were not against all war. They were completely behind Cuban involvement in Africa and South America. They were all for World War II and the Spanish Civil War, as long as it was against National Socialism. Abandonment of the American blue collar. That's a real treacherous point right there. And the cultivation of the teachers' unions instead. In other words, forget blue collar unions. Let's move into the teacher unions. Boy, are we living with that. So I presented my general background thesis and the contextualization of Pete Seeger and the folk music revival as agents for the introduction of cultural Marxism into American society. This background contextualization wasn't intended to be a biography of Seeger or a history of the unions of America. I just wanted to lay out the intersections between the union movement, the folk revival, and cultural Marxism. So now let's move on to the specific incidences that I want to address that would support my general thesis. And here we really get more into the music.
Racist! Fascist!